Hi, I'm here with Professor Amartya Sen, who is a professor of economics and a professor of philosophy at the University of Harvard. He is also the 1998 Nobel Prize winner in economics. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Good morning. To immediately start with the first question, you've been born and raised and educated in India, and a lot of your work has focused on development in your country. What do you think, or what do you consider being the most pressing challenges India is currently facing in its development?
I'm not sure that I would like to identify one as the most pressing. There's so many different pressing things. And one of the difficulties of just picking up one from a basket of really serious problems is that it tends to undermine the others. We have to look at the collectivity of the problems. We have neglected education, considerable proportion of the population still not covered, bad standard of education. We have neglected healthcare. Lots of people don't have any healthcare at all. And even those who do, we also have some of the finest healthcare in the world, but for most people it's not like that at all. So bad healthcare, there would be another one. Hardly any kind of social security. Now things are happening there. Food subsidies for the help of those who can't afford to buy the food at the market prices. Also employment guarantee, which gives rural families some kind of an income. But there's so many different problems into which also fit the story of straightforward income poverty, low income for lots of people. I think that's the combination of problems that we ought to look at.
India has shown a very impressive GDP growth rate in the past years. It was at about 7% per year on average for the past 15 years. That rate is very impressive, yet it hasn't sufficed to lift hundreds of millions of Indians out of poverty. What is crucial in an approach that could lift all those people out of poverty?
Well, it's a very good question. That 7% average is a bit deceptive because for some years, until this year, the growth rate was much higher than that, namely 8-9%, but much earlier 5-6%. So the very high growth rate is relatively more recent than just the 15-year period you mentioned. But it's certainly the case that it hasn't had the kind of impact one could have expected it to have. And that is often the case because what growth does is to raise people's income, overall income, without taking any kind of notice of how to reduce inequality. Growth increases the resources in the hands of the government. The government of India, for example, today has in real terms 4 times as much resource as it did 20 years ago, which is quite a big rise. Yeah. But it depends on how it's spent and so on. If you look at a country like Brazil, you can see the transition until about 15, I'd say about the transition 18, 19 years ago. Until then, the growth rate was high, but its reach on the people were quite poor. Education, health, and inequality, backwardness were all these issues. And then, of course, there was a deliberate policy to change it. And I think Brazil, I've just come back from Brazil, has had a major success in terms of getting universal education, universal health coverage. The quality of education and health coverage still grumbles justifiably, but they're trying to tackle it. But you have to get a determined approach to use growth as a means of human development touching the entire population. Now, despite the success in growth, that aspect of the picture has been missing. Not only the government picture, because what the government does in democracy depends very much on what people demand, what the political parties agitate for. So that kind of development being the primary dialogue hasn't yet happened, unfortunately, in what is a glorious record of democratic governance, beginning from when the British left in 1947 to today. So I think that is a failure of engagement with democracy, using the means of democracy to press for more changes, which is to some extent what happened in Brazil. And I think we ought to look at that in a open-minded way. Do not go against growth. That's completely wrong policy. You do need the growth because, for one thing, well, it generates private income, but it also gives government a lot of resources. And that could be used for all the purposes for which public revenue should be used.
A little bit more about sustainable paths of development. Many believe that the socio and economical development of countries such as India may conflict with global environmental changes or global environmental challenges such as climate change. What is your take on this? Do you believe that countries such as India can develop in a way that they can leapfrog the carbon and resource intensive path of growth that the West has followed in the past?
Well, I think the short answer is yes. I don't like the word leapfrog much, because that sort of puts India into a kind of horse race with other countries, leaping over it like little barriers that the show horse jumping people do. I don't think that's the right way of thinking about it. It's a question of learning from the world, as well as having a more just world. Learning from the world particularly applies to technology. What are the new technologies that we have to cultivate? And I gather this conference that will take place is much concerned with that. And there it's not a question of leapfrogging, it's a question of learning from others and then innovating. India has a long tradition of innovation, and there's already some signs of that happening on the environmental field, and we could do more, a lot more. But there's also a question of a division of the responsibilities across the world about global warming. And the Chinese keep complaining, and not entirely without reason, that the Europeans and Americans polluted the world for 200 years. And just when China started the industrial development, they said, no, the rules are all changed, you can't do it anymore. Now that cannot wash, and the reason why Copenhagen in 2009 wasn't a success is that there wasn't a discussion about what would be a good, just basis of global sharing. Not that you penalize the West for what they had done in the past. That's a silly thing to do. First of all, they didn't know it, and as we know from the experience of South Africa, Mandela and Tutu's leadership, that it's always a mistake to deal with past crimes. What you have to see is what's the impact of the past inequities on today. And it is an unequal world in which the United States has a huge share of global warming. Europe has too. China becoming big too. We have to think about how to balance that. India might. And then there are some countries in Africa, for example, which hasn't started growing at all. And they will need some room to pollute, to want of a better word. And so we have to think about a global just arrangement. And the other point I would mention is that I've been looking at numbers. If you look at the cost of some of the cleaner energies, take the energy creation through wind power or particularly solar power, they look quite expensive. But by the time if you factor in what economists call externalities, namely the impact of the environment, for example, the coal burning, which is the cheapest form of fuel now, what it does to global warming, or you take nuclear, what it does to the security risk, as well as possibility of accidents and dangers, as happened in the Fukushima Daiichi. So I think once externality is taken into account, many of the clean energies are relatively speaking much cheaper than it appears if you have a calculation where the externalities are ignored.
We've talked a little bit about technological development, but Vito as an institute also is very interested in societal changes that need to happen, changes in lifestyle, in consumption patterns to put countries on a path to a more sustainable way of developing. What processes in societal patterns should happen?
Well, the societal pattern is a very general term. I think in it there are at least three different things. First of all, science is a part of society too, namely what do we know, what can we hope for, what can we expect, what should we strive for. That's certainly a first element of the three I want to emphasize. And that, of course, would be very important in the context of recognizing that technological progress, sometimes it happens by accident, but mostly it doesn't. They mostly happen because you're looking for something. The particular method may finally have an accidental element in it, but the search is very important. So there is a kind of constant search for clean energy, in which Teri and other organizations in India have been particularly active. They're very important to change that societal picture. The second element is to have much greater environment consciousness in public discussion. We discussed earlier about the limitations of the growth alone strategy without making growth as a vehicle for enhancing the living conditions and freedoms, substantive freedoms of human beings living in the society. So similarly, environment consciousness has to be another one, which is very important. And third has to be that the market economy has become quite big in India, is likely to remain big and will continue to grow, and that's fine within its terms, within its confinement and within the regulation that would be needed. But the regulations concern environment. It also requires incentives. If you want to reflect the externalities, which I was talking about, the impact on the environment, the impact on the society of modern industrial production, or for that matter, agricultural production and its ancillaries, then you have to also think about price incentives, like carbon tax would be one way of looking at it. So all these are matters of societal change. I don't think you sort of pine for society to be reborn. Like it's not a moral rearmament that you're looking for. I think you're looking for change that is feasible, that can be done, and that's based on reasoning.
How far do you think India is in valuing or in subsidizing this a more sustainable economy? How much does the government right now create incentives for companies, for example?
You see, these will be always a matter for debate, because you have to balance growth requirements, income generation, and along with that, the resources to be generated for the government to spend on education, healthcare, and other things, against its impact. I mean, if you take the car industry, the automobile or the motor car industry has taken off in India in a way that I couldn't have expected earlier.
Incredible.
And suddenly it happened. Now, it's certainly generating a lot of income, giving the middle class, which are very dominant in India. And then I'm using not middle class in the sense they're used in the United States, meaning pretty much everyone other than all the poor, other than the absolutely poorest. I'm in middle class, a relatively prosperous middle class. And then they enjoy these particularly small cars and they shuttle around town and so on. I don't grumble about that at all. But on the other hand, they do have environmental costs. These have to be reflected in the prices. And one has to think about the priorities on roads. I think one of the things went wrong in India and in many countries in the world is the neglect of rails. Nowhere perhaps more so than in the United States. And Europe, of course, is much better in this respect. I mean, take France. It's done pretty well on railways, though it's I believe it's sort of sitting on a volcano on nuclear energy. So all these have to be rethought. Something to learn from France, railway network, and at the same time, not so much to learn from the total reliance on nuclear energy. And there are so many other things that we can learn from the world. And, I think we live in an interdependent global world, and it would be very difficult to think of India evolving alone. What can it learn from the world? And when it's successful, what can it teach the world? I think these are the ways in which we have to think about it, and this kind of conference, which I believe what I'm singing for at this moment is supposed to be discussion about that.
As a research institute, Vito is building knowledge, scientifically underpinned information, in service of sustainable development. What is, according to you, the role of wisdom, of ethics, in getting the necessary societal changes to sustainability on track? What do we need to change in our ways of thinking about sustainable development?
I don't think an institute can bring about the change in the ethics of a society. That would be far too glamorous a role for an institute to seek. That belongs to the pages of Vogue, and it doesn't come quite in the
But how can it contribute?
It can contribute by, first of all, bringing ethical considerations into its own reasoning. I think ethics is best taught by lecture, not lecturing on ethics, but what people do. And the institute has morality too. The institutes compete with each other, sometimes cut each other out. Even in the field of environment, there could be pretty cutthroat competition between one institute leadership and another. We have to see the behavior of ethical behavior of every institute in this context, every initiative. No, I think that's the way to think about it. And the ethics is a byproduct of understanding. I think that wonderful remark of Wittgenstein, the great philosopher Ludwig von Wittgenstein, where he said, "Sometimes I wish I was a better man." That means more smart, more intelligent. Now, I'm puzzled about that. What he was saying is that a lot of the inanities and nastiness we do, unethical behavior, comes from our inability to comprehend how nasty they are, rather than any kind of ethical failure on its own. So epistemology, the science of knowledge, and ethics, the science of practical reason, are closely related. So I think what a conference of this kind can do, or an initiative of this kind, is to bring greater understanding, greater knowledge, greater communication, greater solid-based reasoning about what kind of a society we want. And ethics would be part and parcel of the evolution that comes from it.
My last question to conclude is focusing on rural development. How do you see the role of technological change in rural development in India? And by extension, how do you see the role of the rural economy in a technological society? For example, we can think of the possible advent of a bio-based economy where farmers would not only produce food but also energy and chemical compounds that can then benefit the whole economy.
You know, the short answer is I don't know. We value the rural economy because a lot of people value rural life. Yeah. Having spent my first 15 years in rather backward rural conditions, and having studied under hurricane lantern and difficulty of reading what's going on with flickering light, I don't pine for the rural society as much as some others do. I think many people who pine for rural society live solidly an urban life and feel deeply nostalgic about an experience they have actually not had. But and it's a challenging intellectual problem for nostalgia. I don't think we should begin by saying what can the rural economy do, how can we preserve it, and so on. Of course, people like the rural economy. Mahatma Gandhi spoke so eloquently about that. What was driving Gandhi, I think, is not so much the particular technology that he suggested, whether charkha is the best way of improving the mind and so on. On this, I'd have to remain skeptical. But the general search that if people had fondness for a certain type of living tradition, then could we not make technology and modernity come even in that area without changing the basis of something which we really do value? It's a very complex question. And I think for me to sit here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and to pontificate on biomass would be one of the most outrageous things that I can imagine. If I were listening to this, I would have at that point shut off the television. So I think you have to forgive me for not being able to answer that question. But the search, yes. And while not answering the question, asking another question, what kind of society do we want? And what is it in the rural life that we like? Why is it that we want the rural economy to be more productive? Many countries have gone in very different directions in their rural life. And what can we learn from them? Constantly we have to ask the question. The world offers us tremendous variety of experiences, urban, rural, industrial, agricultural, different kinds of energy, different lifestyles, different types of commodities, different patterns of trade. What can we learn from them? And what would be our contribution in that? That, I think your last question fits into that general inquiry, to keep an examining open mind. You rely on reasoning rather than either a fetishistic pursuit of a particular lifestyle or a fetishistic rejection of that lifestyle without examining what the possibilities are within that lifestyle. So if your meeting ends up discussing all that, I think the people attending them should be very grateful.
But well, thank you for making time to talk to us and address our conference in Belgium.